An unbridgeable rift in the previously united movement for Irish freedom. 75 years later, Bryan Dobson presents a full account and analysis of Ireland's Civil War.
On the 19th of March 1921, one of the biggest engagements of the Anglo-Irish War took place here at Crossbarry, 10 miles west of Cork City on the road to Bandon. Surrounded by British troops and vastly outnumbered, the West Cork Flying Column under Tom Barry inflicted a terrible defeat on the men of the Essex and Hampshire regiments. 39 British soldiers were killed and 3 IRA men. One of the IRA commanders that day was a young Cork man, Sean Hales. 2 years later, Sean Hales was dead. A Dáil deputy, he was assassinated by former Republican comrades because of his decision to support the Anglo-Irish Treaty. The next day, in response to Sean Hales's murder, his neighbour and former Republican colleague Richard Barrett was executed on the orders of the Provisional Government. Writing from Mountjoy Jail the morning before his death, Barrett condemned this reprisal execution, but told his family that he was ready to die for the sweet and glorious cause of Irish freedom. A week later, Sean Hales's family wrote to the Cork Examiner to express their horror and disgust at what they described as the criminal folly of Richard Barrett's execution. The Hales family, except for Sean, had taken the anti-treaty side. Indeed, Sean's brother Tom would eventually lead the ambush party which killed Michael Collins. Within months, old comrades had been set at each other's throats, not just in Cork, but throughout the country, in a conflict which divided families, communities, and the nation. Crossbarry represented what a united Republican movement could achieve against overwhelming odds. But within 2 years, that unity was gone, replaced by a bitter, divisive, and vindictive civil war. One of the darkest periods of recent Irish history had begun. To some, it was the defining moment of Ireland's political life in the 20th century. To others, it was little more than a series of petty, disorganised squabbles, fought out over the heads and against the wishes of a bewildered, war-weary population.
I was elected by men and women of all parties and none, by many with great moral courage, who stepped out from the faded flags of the Civil War.
Faded maybe in the 1990s, but 75 years ago, the flags of war were flying high. The Minister for Defence, Richard Mulcahy, called on his forces to rally against their anti-treaty enemies, whose campaign he described as a madness from within. A madness perhaps that still dogs Ireland on the threshold of a new millennium. 1922 began with Ireland in apprehensive mood. Negotiations in London just before Christmas had produced the treaty, but the Irish team, led by Michael Collins, already knew that securing support for the agreement back home would prove extremely difficult. especially given contentious issues such as the oath of allegiance to the British Crown, to be taken by members of any new Irish Parliamentary Assembly. The treaty debates began as a series of disciplined exchanges. But as an expectant nation held its breath, soon descended into bitter division. The celebrated leaders of the War of Independence were slowly moving in opposite directions. The root causes of this division, however, lay in decisions taken months previously, especially by President Eamon de Valera.
He seemed to have a perpetual brainstorm right from the time he met Lloyd George in July of 1921. He didn't take Collins over with him. He insulted him by leaving him at home. He saw what was on offer. He was alone for 3 or 4 days with Lloyd George, two of the shrewdest political brains in Europe. He knew exactly what was on the table, and he just wasn't going to pick it up.
It is a personal certainty of mine that Mr. de Valera, unable to persuade Michael to go, spoke with Bat O'Connor, Michael's closest friend, and asked him to do whatever he could over whatever length of time to persuade Michael to go. And the final question was when Michael said, "No, I'm being set up." He said, "Deb asked me, would you go for love of Ireland?" He bloody well knew, he said, the one reason I wouldn't refuse. "I'll go, Bat," he said, "and I'll do my damn best, and I can do no more."
The treaty was eventually endorsed by a narrow margin, just 7 votes. The majority, led by Arthur Griffith, W.T. Cosgrave, Kevin O'Higgins and above all Collins, saw it as a stepping stone to fuller Irish freedom. But to the anti-treaty minority under de Valera, the Dáil had no right to dismantle the Irish Republic, already established by the votes of the people in 1919. Where Collins favoured pragmatism, de Valera and his supporters were standing on the high moral ground of the Republic. Compromise on this fundamental principle was not likely.
The great majority of Irish nationalists simply wanted peace, along with as much independence as could be got. They weren't extremists. On the other hand, there was a small group, including some politicians like Cathal Brugha and Austin Stagg, but by and large concentrated in the army, that wouldn't accept any compromise, that were committed to the abstraction of the Republic, that wouldn't accept any element of a monarchical connection, and were quite happy to go back to war with the British. And the crucial third element that came in between the two extremes and was decisive was people like Collins.
The worst factor of all was the rhetoric of the Republic. The fact that Sinn Féin and the Dáil and all the Sinn Féin people spoke about the Republic all the time as if it was an achievable possibility in a country which only 10 years before had not 1% of people supported, well, hardly more than 1 or 2% supported the 1916 rebellion until after the execution. So the people of Ireland up to 1916 were largely remaining at least within the British Commonwealth, or in fact they would have settled for home rule or devolution, which was a much less radical kind of arrangement.
The tension that had dogged the treaty debates now spilled over onto the streets. In the early months of 1922, the leaders of the opposing sides forced home their contrasting positions to an anxious electorate. The people were being asked to choose between the two political Goliaths, who together had taken the country to its independence.
People voted in the Dáil by a majority of 7 to accept the treaty, and that's the only authority I'd obey. And the only authority I knew is the vote of the majority of the people. And I said, de Valera, in my mind, had no right to go out on his own and set up the situation he set up and start the civil war by saying he'd have to lead the Irish people through a sea of blood before all this was ended. Well, I think that remark did a lot towards ending de Valera himself.
When I saw the Grand Young men, they were